The Tangled Web of Major Metcalfe, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a man the village believed it understood perfectly, Major Metcalfe, a retired officer known for his discipline, quiet habits, and impeccable reputation. To the people of St. Mary Mead, he was simply another respectable neighbor with stories of distant campaigns and a life that seemed carefully ordered. But when a small, puzzling incident begins to unravel the neat threads of his past, Miss Marple notices something troubling. Certain names provoke uneasy reactions, old letters surface at inconvenient moments, and the Major himself seems far too eager to keep certain memories buried. As the quiet clues begin to connect, Miss Marple realizes that the Major's life is not a straight line at all, but a tangled web of secrets, loyalties, and deception that stretches far beyond the village. Because sometimes, the most respectable lives are the ones most carefully constructed. Before we unravel the tangled web of Major Metcalfe, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Tangled Web begins. The village of St. Mary Mead had long enjoyed the comfort of predictability. The same church bells rang each Sunday, the same shopkeepers opened their doors each morning, and the same familiar faces passed along the narrow lanes lined with hedges and rose gardens. It was the sort of place where people believed they understood one another completely. Yet Miss Jane Marple often reflected that a village was like a spider's web. Every strand connected to another, and once something disturbed the center, the tremor could be felt everywhere. It was on a cool autumn morning that Major Arthur Metcalfe first appeared in the village. The arrival of a new resident was always an event in St. Mary Mead, and by the afternoon nearly everyone had heard the news that a retired army officer had purchased Rosewood Cottage at the edge of the village. The house itself was pleasant but modest, sitting quietly behind a low hedge with ivy creeping up its stone walls. It had been empty for months before the Major's arrival, and many villagers had wondered who might eventually settle there. Major Metcalfe seemed, at first glance, the perfect addition to the community. He was a tall man with a straight back and a calm, confident manner that spoke of discipline and authority. His hair was grey and neatly combed, and his mustache was trimmed with precise care. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent many years in uniform. When he spoke, his voice was deep and steady, and his words were measured in a way that suggested he was used to being listened to. Naturally, the villagers welcomed him with polite curiosity. Mrs. Harmon at the tea shop was among the first to make his acquaintance, offering him a warm smile and a fresh cup of tea when he stopped by during his first week. Major Metcalfe spoke politely with her and mentioned that he had recently retired from military service and wished to spend his remaining years somewhere peaceful. St. Mary Mead, he explained, seemed like the perfect place for quiet living. Before long he became a familiar sight along the village lanes. Each morning he walked with a steady pace, carrying a polished walking stick that tapped lightly against the path as he passed. He attended church services on Sunday, greeting the vicar with respectful courtesy, and he spoke with neighbors in a friendly but somewhat reserved manner. The villagers quickly formed the impression that Major Metcalfe was a respectable gentleman who valued privacy but appreciated good company. Miss Marple observed all of this from her usual place in her garden, where she spent many afternoons knitting and watching the world beyond her hedge. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for many years and had developed an extraordinary understanding of human nature simply by observing the habits of her neighbors. Villages, she believed, provided the perfect environment for studying people, because everyone eventually revealed their true selves. One afternoon, as Major Metcalfe passed by her gate, he paused politely and tipped his hat. Miss Marple returned the greeting with a gentle smile and a few friendly words about the pleasant autumn weather. The exchange was brief and entirely ordinary. Yet as the Major continued down the lane, Miss Marple remained thoughtful. Something about him did not quite fit. She could not immediately say what it was. The Major appeared perfectly respectable, and nothing in his behavior seemed openly suspicious. Still, Miss Marple had learned through long experience that small details often told the most important stories. The first detail appeared during a conversation at the tea shop several days later. Mrs. Harmon, who enjoyed hearing stories about distant places, asked the Major about his years in the army. The Major responded easily, mentioning that he had spent much of his service stationed in Africa. He spoke in a confident tone and described the climate and landscapes in a way that sounded believable. Miss Marple happened to be sitting nearby with her tea and a small plate of biscuits. She listened quietly without appearing particularly interested. A few minutes later, Mr. Carter from the post office joined the conversation and asked the Major a similar question about his travels. This time the Major answered that he had spent most of his service years in India. The change was subtle, and no one else appeared to notice it. But Miss Marple did. It was a small inconsistency, easily dismissed by most people as a simple mistake. Yet Miss Marple had observed enough human behavior to know that people rarely confused such things unless they were inventing their stories. She said nothing at the time, but the observation remained in her mind. Over the next several weeks, other small details began to appear, each one adding another thread to the growing sense that Major Metcalfe was not entirely what he seemed. One curious fact was that the Major received very little mail. In a village where the arrival of letters was almost a daily event, this stood out as unusual. A retired officer who had served many years would normally maintain correspondence with former colleagues or old friends. Yet the postman rarely delivered anything to Rosewood Cottage. Another detail involved the Major's reluctance to discuss his past in any real depth. When people asked casual questions, he answered politely but briefly. If someone attempted to explore the subject further, he would gently change the topic or excuse himself from the conversation. None of this was truly alarming, but it created a subtle impression that the Major preferred to keep certain matters hidden. Then came the first truly strange occurrence. One evening, Mr. Collins the grocer was returning home after closing his shop when he noticed a man standing near the gate of Rosewood Cottage. The stranger wore a dark coat and hat that partially concealed his face. Mr. Collins could see that Major Metcalfe was speaking with him just inside the gate. The conversation appeared tense. The two men stood close together, speaking quietly but with visible seriousness. At one point the stranger made a sharp gesture with his hand, as if emphasizing a point in an argument. After a few minutes the stranger turned abruptly and walked away down the road, disappearing into the darkness beyond the village lamps. Mr. Collins thought little of the matter at the time, but the next day he mentioned the incident while chatting at the shop. Within hours the story had spread across St. Mary Mead, as such stories always did. When Miss Marple heard the account, she listened thoughtfully. Visitors were not unusual, of course, but there had been something about the description that caught her attention. The stranger had arrived late in the evening and left quickly, without greeting anyone else in the village. It was the sort of visit that suggested unfinished business. Around the same time, another unusual detail came to light. Dr. Haydock had been called to Rosewood Cottage late one night after the Major reported feeling unwell. When the doctor arrived, he found the Major sitting comfortably in his armchair, looking somewhat embarrassed about the fuss. He insisted it had only been a moment of dizziness. Dr. Haydock examined him carefully and found no serious problems. The Major appeared perfectly healthy, and before long he laughed the matter off as nothing more than a passing discomfort. Yet as the doctor prepared to leave, he noticed something curious in the study. A desk drawer had been left slightly open. Inside it was a small revolver. Dr. Haydock paused for a moment but said nothing. Many people kept firearms for protection, particularly in rural areas. Still, the sight lingered in his mind as he walked home through the quiet village streets. Why would a man living peacefully in St. Mary Mead feel the need to keep a weapon so close at hand? As autumn deepened and the evenings grew darker, the atmosphere around Rosewood Cottage began to feel strangely tense. Several villagers mentioned seeing unfamiliar figures near the road that led to the cottage. Most assumed these sightings were nothing more than travelers passing through, but the pattern was enough to create quiet curiosity. One night Miss Marple herself noticed something unusual. She was sitting by her window, knitting as she often did before bedtime, when she saw a faint lantern light moving across the distant fields beyond the hedges. The light flickered slowly along the path that led toward Rosewood Cottage. The movement seemed careful and deliberate, as though the person carrying the lantern wished to avoid attention. Miss Marple watched silently until the light disappeared behind the hedgerow. Moments later it went out entirely. The next morning the village awoke to shocking news. Major Arthur Metcalfe had been found dead inside Rosewood Cottage. The discovery was made by his housekeeper, who arrived early as usual and found the front door slightly open. When she entered the study, she saw the Major lying on the floor near his desk. Dr. Haydock was summoned immediately, but by the time he arrived it was clear that nothing could be done. The Major had been shot once in the chest. Inspector Slack from the county police soon arrived to examine the scene. The study showed no signs of forced entry, and the windows were locked from the inside. The room itself was orderly, with papers neatly arranged across the desk. But one important detail was missing. The revolver that had once been kept in the desk drawer was gone. Inspector Slack stood quietly in the study as he considered the situation. It appeared that the Major had either allowed his killer inside or had known the person well enough not to fear them. Outside the cottage gate, a small crowd of villagers had gathered, speaking in hushed voices. Miss Marple stood among them, her expression thoughtful. When Inspector Slack stepped outside, he noticed her immediately. She greeted him politely and expressed her sorrow over the tragedy that had occurred. The inspector sighed heavily. "A terrible business," he said. "It seems our quiet village has gained itself a murder." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes," she said. "And I fear the truth may prove rather complicated." Inspector Slack studied her with interest. "What makes you say that?" Miss Marple glanced toward the silent cottage. "Well, Inspector," she replied softly, "Major Metcalfe was a man surrounded by small inconsistencies." The inspector frowned slightly. "Inconsistencies?" Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Yes. The sort of details that often form the beginning of a very tangled web." Inspector Slack followed her gaze toward Rosewood Cottage. At that moment he did not yet understand how complicated the case would become. But Miss Marple already suspected that the man who had called himself Major Metcalfe had been hiding far more than a simple lie. And somewhere within the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, someone knew exactly why he had died. Chapter 2: The Web Tightens. The murder of Major Arthur Metcalfe changed the atmosphere of St. Mary Mead almost overnight. A village that had once been peaceful and predictable now carried a quiet tension beneath its polite conversations. People still greeted one another at the shop and outside the church, but their voices were softer, and their eyes lingered a little longer on the road that led to Rosewood Cottage. Inspector Slack quickly established himself in the village hall and began speaking to anyone who might have known the Major. At first the information he gathered seemed ordinary. The Major had been polite, well-spoken, and somewhat private. He attended church regularly, took long walks through the lanes, and occasionally visited the tea shop. No one could recall him having any open arguments or enemies in the village. Yet the more the inspector listened, the more he began to notice that people knew very little about the man himself. Everyone had spoken with Major Metcalfe, but no one had truly known him. His past remained vague, filled with general statements but almost no real details. Mrs. Harmon at the tea shop told Inspector Slack about the conversation regarding the Major's military service. She remembered how confidently he had spoken about his years abroad, but she admitted that the details were always rather broad. He had mentioned distant places and long service, but he never named specific units or officers. When the inspector later spoke with Mr. Carter from the post office, he heard something even more interesting. Mr. Carter clearly remembered the Major saying he had spent much of his service in India. That alone would not have been unusual, but Mrs. Harmon had been equally certain that the Major once spoke about years in Africa. The inspector made a careful note of the contradiction. It was a small detail, but small details often revealed the beginning of larger truths. Another important conversation took place with Mr. Collins, the grocer. He described the night he had seen a stranger speaking with the Major near the gate of Rosewood Cottage. According to Mr. Collins, the meeting had not appeared friendly. The two men had stood close together, speaking quietly but with visible tension. Mr. Collins explained that the stranger had been tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face. After several minutes of conversation, the man had left abruptly and disappeared down the road leading away from the village. Inspector Slack listened carefully. "Did Major Metcalfe appear frightened?" he asked. Mr. Collins thought for a moment before answering. "No, sir. Not frightened exactly. But he looked troubled. Like a man who had just heard something unpleasant." The inspector thanked him and added the information to his notes. Later that day he returned to Rosewood Cottage to continue examining the Major's belongings. What he found there only deepened the mystery. The cottage was neat and orderly, but it contained very few personal items. There were no photographs, no letters from family, and nothing that clearly connected the Major to his supposed military career. For a man who had claimed to spend many years in the army, the lack of such evidence seemed very unusual. Inside one desk drawer the inspector discovered a small leather notebook. Most of its pages were empty, but a few contained short entries written in careful handwriting. The notes were brief and somewhat cryptic. Several contained only names followed by dates and small amounts of money. Inspector Slack frowned as he studied the list. The entries did not look like ordinary financial records. They resembled something far more secretive, as though the Major had been keeping track of private dealings with several different people. The inspector closed the notebook slowly. It was becoming increasingly clear that Major Arthur Metcalfe had not been living the quiet retirement he had claimed. That evening Inspector Slack spoke with Miss Marple, who had been following the investigation with quiet interest. They met near the village green as the fading sunlight stretched long shadows across the grass. Miss Marple listened politely as the inspector described the contradictions he had discovered. "It seems," he concluded, "that our Major may not have been entirely honest about his past." Miss Marple nodded gently, as though the idea did not surprise her at all. "Yes," she said. "I rather suspected that." Inspector Slack looked at her with curiosity. "You did?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied calmly. "It was the small things, you see. People who invent stories often forget that the smallest details must remain consistent." The inspector considered this. "So you believe he was lying about his military service?" Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. "I believe," she said slowly, "that Major Metcalfe was pretending to be someone else." Inspector Slack stared at her in surprise. "That's quite a serious claim." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes. But if he truly was living under a false identity, then the question becomes very interesting indeed. The inspector crossed his arms. And what question would that be? Miss Marple looked toward the quiet road leading to Rosewood Cottage. Who discovered the truth about him, she said softly, and why that discovery led to murder. At that moment the tangled web surrounding Major Metcalfe seemed even more complicated than before. Someone in or near St. Mary Mead had known the man's secret. Chapter 3: The Web is Untangled. The following morning St. Mary Mead woke beneath a heavy grey sky, and the quiet lane seemed unusually still. Word of Major Metcalfe's death had already travelled beyond the village, and Inspector Slack knew the case could no longer remain a simple local investigation. Yet despite the growing attention, the answers still seemed just out of reach. The small leather notebook found in the Major's desk remained the most puzzling discovery. Several names were written inside, each followed by dates and small sums of money. None of the entries explained their meaning, but the pattern suggested something deliberate. It looked very much like a record of payments. Inspector Slack had spent hours examining the list, yet none of the names belonged to anyone in St. Mary Mead. That meant the truth of Major Metcalfe's past likely stretched far beyond the village. Still, Miss Marple believed the solution might be much closer than the inspector imagined. She sat in her garden that afternoon with her knitting resting quietly in her lap while she considered everything that had happened since the Major's arrival. Over the years she had learned that the most complicated mysteries were often built from simple human motives. Pride, greed, fear, and desperation had a way of appearing in every village, no matter how peaceful it seemed. Major Metcalfe's story, she suspected, was no different. When Inspector Slack visited her later that day, Miss Marple shared her thoughts carefully. She began by pointing out the strange contradictions in the Major's stories about his military service. A man who had truly served for many years would remember his history clearly. Yet Major Metcalfe had spoken in vague terms and had even contradicted himself. That suggests, Miss Marple explained gently, that he was pretending to be someone he was not. Inspector Slack nodded. I've begun to think the same thing. Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. But if a man invents a false identity, there is usually a reason. He may be hiding from someone, or perhaps from something he once did. The inspector considered this carefully. You believe he was running from his past? Miss Marple gave a small nod. Yes. And I suspect the visitor Mr. Collins saw that evening was someone who recognized him. Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. You mean the stranger knew his true identity? Exactly, Miss Marple said. The inspector frowned. That still leaves the question of murder. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, but the notebook answers that question rather neatly. Inspector Slack looked confused. The notebook. Miss Marple folded her hands. The names and payments strongly suggest that Major Metcalfe was collecting money from several people. In other words, he was blackmailing them. The inspector's eyes widened slightly. You think he had discovered secrets about those people? That seems very likely, Miss Marple replied calmly. A man living under a false identity might become very skilled at uncovering the secrets of others. Inspector Slack stood slowly as the idea settled into place. So the stranger who visited him may have been one of the people he was blackmailing. Or someone connected to them, Miss Marple said. The inspector began pacing thoughtfully. That would explain the tense conversation Mr. Collins described. The visitor may have come to demand that the blackmail stop. Miss Marple nodded. And when Major Metcalfe refused, the situation became desperate. The inspector stopped walking. So the killer used the Major's own revolver. Most likely, Miss Marple said. The pieces now fit together with surprising clarity. Major Metcalfe had arrived in St. Mary Mead under a false identity, hoping to live quietly while continuing his secret activities. But someone from his past had eventually discovered him. When that person confronted him, the tangled web he had created finally collapsed. Inspector Slack sighed as he looked toward the road leading to Rosewood Cottage. "It seems Major Metcalfe's greatest mistake," he said slowly, "was believing he could keep control of so many secrets." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes. Secrets are very dangerous things. They have a way of turning against the people who try to use them." In the days that followed, the investigation beyond the village eventually revealed the truth. The man known as Major Metcalfe had never served in the army at all. His real name had been connected to several past scandals involving blackmail and fraud. The mysterious visitor Mr. Collins had seen was later identified as a relative of one of his victims. Confronted with the Major's threats and desperate to protect his family, the man had acted in anger during their meeting. The tangled web of lies, secrets, and fear had finally been untangled. Life in St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its usual calm. The hedges were trimmed, the shopkeepers opened their doors each morning, and the church bells once again marked the passing of quiet days. Yet Miss Marple knew the village would remember the strange case of Major Metcalfe for many years, because it served as a gentle reminder of something she had always believed. Even the most respectable stranger might be carrying a web of secrets, and sooner or later, every web must break. And if you enjoyed this Miss Marple mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow mystery lovers, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another quiet village hiding a dangerous secret.